For example, a pair of doves, which would have been the normal annual sin sacrifice for a poor family, would have cost $5 outside of the temple. But once you came into the temple, you were forced to pay $100 or even $200 for a pair of doves. And yet the people were trapped because there were so many coming and going that once you were in, you couldn't go back out and come in again. You were stuck there and you had to pay that price. It's like buying a tuna sandwich at the airport. And Jesus hated that. The other thing that Jesus hated about the money changers was the fact that the whole system of sacrifice, let alone that the way they were doing it was corrupt, but the whole system of sacrificing to God was not acceptable to Jesus. Psalm 51 had already said, God doesn't want your sacrifice. Sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit and a contrite heart. Or in the call to worship today from Micah, Micah asks the question, with what shall I come before the Lord? With a burnt offering? With 1,000 rams? With 10,000 rivers of oil? Do I have to give my firstborn, the fruit of my body, for the sin of my soul? No. The Lord has told you what He wants, and this is what God requires of you, that you love kindness, act with justice, and walk in humility with your God. The day of physical sacrifices was over, and Jesus was angered because the people could not raise themselves up above that idea of sin forgiven by sacrifice. Sin is forgiven by the mercy of God. But there was one last thing that enraged Jesus above all else about the money changers and about those who sold the animals. Not that they were corrupt or that they were thieves or that they were practicing a form of religion that in Jesus' mind was totally outdated. It was this. The temple was set up with various courts for different purposes. The inner sanctum of the temple was called the Holy of Holies, and only the priest could go there. The next part of the temple was called the Court of the Jews, and only the Jewish men could go there. The next layer of the temple beyond that was called the Court of the Women, where the women could come, but not quite as close as the men. But the largest part of God's temple, in accordance with God's original building plan, was an area called the Court of the Gentiles. And the Court of the Gentiles was the most magnificent part of the whole temple, because that was the place where all the nations of the world were welcomed to come in and be a part of God's family. And that was the whole reason for the existence of the temple, was to make God accessible to the entire world. But the people of that day had forgotten. All that they wanted was a religion that was self-centered and self-serving and met the needs of a small group of people, so they made the decision, we don't even need the court of the Gentiles. We don't even want those other people to come in and know our God. So they began to use the court of the Gentiles as the place for the money changers and the animal sellers. They took away every possibility for an outsider to come into the house of God. And by doing that, they had recreated perfectly the temple that existed in the time of Malachi, that self-serving temple that had forgotten its whole purpose was to share God's love with the whole world. So if a foreigner came to the temple and wanted to come in, there was no place for them. And further to that, those who were blind or lame were kept out. Those who were widows were kept out. Little children were kept out. There was no space for them. They couldn't go into the court of the men. They couldn't go into the court of the women. And the space that was intended for them was in use for another purpose. That, above the corruption of the sellers and the buyers, that was the reason why Jesus drove those people out of the temple. That's why he made the whip of cords. That's how he fulfilled the prophecy of Malachi, who said, God himself is going to come to your temple and will cleanse you like soap. He cleared out that whole area. And he must have been tremendously effective. I chose the reading from John because it shows Jesus in a far more active and angry light than either of the other Gospels, with the whip of cords, with the physical smashing of the tables and the tipping over of the chairs. And you can see these buyers and sellers running out to the temple gates, such that now the court of the Gentiles is empty. There is this huge space in the temple. We tend to leave the story at that point, and we do not read the few verses that follow the story, particularly in the Gospel account of Matthew, in Matthew 21, starting to read at verse 14. When the court of the Gentiles was emptied out, a very strange thing happened. Of course, the very thing that God had intended in the first place. When that court was cleared of the money changers and the buyers and the sellers, others began to come in. The blind and the lame came into that space. And of course, that was an affront to many people, because the wisdom of the day said that those people were sick because God was punishing them. They were supposed to be sick, and they were not worth coming into the temple. But they began to come in. And then foreigners began to come in through the gates into the space that Jesus had emptied out. And then the poor people began to come in. All those people whom the church of the day had said, they should not be here. God's temple is for the righteous and the good. They began to flood into the space that Jesus had made. And then the last ones to come in. And if you can picture this in your mind, that ancient temple with its great walls, the money changers cleared out, the poor and the foreigners and the sick coming in, and the last ones to come in Matthew 21:14, it says, the little children came in.